Did you know that your mouth is essentially a highly specialized bioreactor?
Which is a kind of gross but very accurate way to think about it.
Right. I mean, we tend to look at our morning oral hygiene routine. You know, the vigorous brushing, the neon blue mouthwash as this definitive reset button.
Yeah, like you're starting with a completely blank slate.
Exactly. We assume we're establishing this sterile, impenetrable fortress for the rest of the day. But if you actually look at the microbiology, treating the oral microbiome with that kind of scorched earth approach is, well, it's like trying to manage a complex, ancient rainforest with a bulldozer.
That's a great analogy. Sure. Because the underlying assumption there is that a mechanical scrub somehow dictates the biological reality. But as anyone who still gets that fuzzy plaque buildup by 3 p.m. knows, the bacterial ecosystem is remarkably resilient.
It just bounces right back.
It does. Mechanical cleaning removes the structural buildup in the short term, sure, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the chemical signaling or, the competitive balance between the microbial populations that just reestablish themselves hours later.
Which is exactly why we have a massive stack of sources on the table for today's deep dive.
Yes, we do.
We are looking at recent clinical trial data on oral pathogens, university grant papers detailing bacterial genetics, and we're anchoring it all with this really fascinating 2026 review from Biopreneur.
Written by Amy Richards.
Right, by Amy Richards. And she takes this forensic look at a buzzy, chewable oral health supplement called DentaBiome. So our mission today is to cross-reference this product's claims against the actual microbiological literature. We want to see what happens when genuine, peer-reviewed science collides with, like, the Wild West of dietary supplement marketing.
And what's really fascinating here is that the true value of dissecting this review isn't just about arriving at a binary, buy or don't buy conclusion about DentaBiome.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Exactly. It provides a perfect case study on the mechanics of translation. We're looking at how a highly specific in vitro laboratory mechanism gets packaged, streamlined, and, frankly, sometimes aggressively reinterpreted just to convince a consumer to hand over their credit card.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because DentaBiome is completely bypassing the standard approach.
They really are.
They aren't just throwing more live probiotic bacteria at the problem to try and fix bad breath or bleeding gums. They are utilizing a delivery system built entirely on postbiotics.
Which is a crucial distinction.
It is. And whether you're someone trying to optimize your own oral health routine, or you're just intensely curious about the metabolic pathways happening in your mouth right now, we are going to build the exact framework you need to evaluate these next-generation health claims.
So, to really understand this shift from probiotics to postbiotics in oral care, we have to look at why the traditional market leaders, products like Prodentum or Provident, face such steep biological hurdles. The fundamental bottleneck for any live oral probiotic is simply the science of survival and colonization.
The math on live probiotics just doesn't work in the mouth. I always visualize it like trying to parachute a team of elite troops into a Category 5 hurricane.
That's fairly accurate, honestly.
Right. You swallow a capsule containing billions of live beneficial bacteria, but they are immediately subjected to salivary amylase, lysozymes, and all these other harsh digestive enzymes that specifically evolved to break down foreign bodies.
The host environment is overtly hostile to them.
Yeah, it's a war zone.
And the few bacteria that do survive that initial salivary gauntlet then face a secondary and arguably harder challenge, which is adhesion.
They have to actually stick to something.
Exactly. They must physically attach to the oral mucosa or the dental pellicle and begin replicating to form their own protective biofilm. And if you're taking a live strain in a traditional solid capsule, the contact time with your oral tissue is measured in seconds.
It's just too fast.
Way too fast. The vast majority of those live cultures are flushed directly into the highly acidic environment of the stomach, where a pH of like 1.5 to 3.5 destroys them entirely.
So, if the live probiotics are the paratroopers jumping into the hurricane and largely failing to deploy, DentaBiome's postbiotic approach is like skipping the troops entirely and just dropping off the necessary supplies directly on the ground.
Precisely.
Because in 2021, the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics defined a postbiotic as a preparation of inanimate microorganisms or their components that confers a health benefit. They are already non-living.
And that distinction changes the entire delivery paradigm. A postbiotic contains the beneficial metabolites, the short-chain fatty acids, the enzymes, the signaling peptides that the live bacteria would theoretically produce if they managed to colonize.
If they survived the hurricane.
Right. And because DentaBiome is a chewable tablet that dissolves slowly, it physically coats the gingival margins and interproximal spaces with these pre-made compounds. You are entirely bypassing those survival and colonization bottlenecks.
Which makes total logical sense for targeted delivery. But dropping off generic biological supplies doesn't automatically stop tooth decay.
No, it doesn't.
We have to look at how these postbiotics interact with the specific pathogens we're trying to stop. And that takes us to the absolute centerpiece of DentaBiome's marketing, the concept they have plastered everywhere, the FabM enzyme acid lock.
Right, and the scientific origin of this claim is entirely legitimate and, honestly, incredibly elegant microbiology.
It's super cool.
The narrative starts with Streptococcus mutans, which is the primary carcinogenic or cavity-causing bacterium in the human mouth. S. mutans thrives on dietary carbohydrates.
It loves sugar.
It loves sugar. And when it metabolizes that sugar, it produces lactic acid as a byproduct.
And that's the acid that demineralizes your tooth enamel.
Exactly. But producing that much acid actually creates an existential crisis for the bacteria itself.
Because it's generating so much toxic waste that it's altering the pH of its own environment to a lethal level.
Yes. The organism had to evolve a highly specialized defense mechanism just to avoid destroying itself with its own waste. And that mechanism was thoroughly detailed in studies starting around 2002 at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And it was later expanded upon by a research team at the University of Rochester Medical Center.
Fueled by a $3.6 million federal grant, right?
Yep, a massive grant. They isolated a specific enzyme inside S. mutans called enol acyl carrier protein reductase, or FabM.
Yeah, I dug into the University of Rochester grant papers on this, and the chemical mechanics are mind-blowing. When the environment becomes dangerously acidic, S. mutans uses this FabM enzyme to rapidly alter the lipid composition of its own cell membrane.
It's a brilliant survival strategy.
It actively converts straight-chain saturated fatty acids into monounsaturated fatty acids, so this structural change makes the bacterial cell wall more fluid and permeable, which prevents the acidic environment from essentially crystallizing and shattering the cell membrane. It's like a localized molecular shield.
It is. And the Rochester researchers took this a step further in the lab. They used genetic engineering to completely delete the FabM gene from a strain of S. mutans.
Just turned it off entirely.
Right. And without the ability to produce the enzyme and alter their lipid membranes, the mutant bacteria lost their acid resistance. The survivability of the bacteria dropped by 3.5 log units.
And a 3.5 log unit drop means the cavity-causing bacteria became roughly 10,000 times more vulnerable to being destroyed by their own acidic byproducts.
The bacteria essentially committed metabolic suicide. Without FabM, normal sugar consumption creates a localized environment that the pathogen can no longer survive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because as a consumer, I read that 10,000 times more vulnerable statistic, and my wallet immediately comes out.
Of course. It sounds incredible.
But we have to apply some rigorous critical thinking here. Deleting a specific gene sequence from a highly controlled, genetically engineered bacterial culture inside a sterile laboratory incubator is a completely different universe than, like, me chewing a berry-flavored commercial supplement after my morning coffee.
Worlds apart.
So we have to ask on behalf of everyone listening, did DentaBiome actually run clinical trials proving their finished chewable tablet inhibits the FabM enzyme in a living human mouth?
They did not.
Right.
And this is the critical reality check that Amy Richards really emphasizes in the Biopreneur review. The underlying biochemical vulnerability of S. mutans via the FabM enzyme is undisputed in the literature. That's real.
It's rock-solid science.
But projecting that a proprietary blend of consumer-grade postbiotics actively disrupts that exact genetic pathway in vivo, like in the actual human mouth, is an enormous leap of marketing imagination. The company is taking a genuine, peer-reviewed mechanism of action and basically dressing their product in its lab coat.
They are selling a hypothesis as a proven feature.
Exactly.
We have a product built on sound biological principles, bypassing the live probiotic failure point, but it's heavily reliant on borrowed scientific authority. Because the FabM mechanism hasn't been proven for this specific tablet, we have to look past the marketing story and analyze the actual physical chemistry of the ingredients.
Right. And the formula does contain several compounds with robust independent clinical backing, starting with Xylitol. The literature on Xylitol's effect on oral pathogens spans decades, and the mechanism is fascinating because it exploits a flaw in how S. mutans identifies its food.
Yeah, the bacteria can't tell the difference between a 5-carbon and a 6-carbon molecular structure.
It's a blind spot for them.
S mutans relies on 6-carbon sugars like glucose for energy. But xylitol is a 5-carbon sugar alcohol, so the bacteria imports the xylitol through its transport system thinking it's about to get a big meal, and it phosphorylates it into xylitol 5-phosphate. But its metabolic machinery just can't process the 5-carbon structure.
So the bacteria expends vital ATP, its cellular energy, to bring the xylitol in, only to realize it's metabolically useless, and then it has to expend even more energy to expel the molecule.
It's just wasting energy.
Yes, it
Wow.
creates this futile, energy-draining cycle. The bacteria essentially starves itself to death while trying to metabolize a compound that yields zero energy and, importantly, zero enamel-eroding lactic acid.
Wow. Then the review highlights cranberry extract, specifically pointing to A-type proanthocyanidins, or PACs. Now, I assume this was just a standard antioxidant play, but the molecular interaction is actually highly mechanical.
It's very physical, yeah.
The A-type linkages in these specific PACs bind to the P-fimbriae on the surface of the bacteria. And those fimbriae are the microscopic appendages the bacteria use to anchor themselves to the teeth and gums. So by binding to them, the cranberry extract effectively neutralizes the bacteria's grappling hooks.
And it is a non-bactericidal approach, which is interesting. You aren't necessarily killing the pathogen outright. You are just making the oral environment physically inhospitable for
Yeah.
biofilm formation.
Because they can't hold on.
Right. If the bacteria cannot anchor to the dental pellicle, it is easily washed away by normal salivary flow before it can multiply. And coupled with the L-plantarum postbiotic complex, which competitively inhibits the remaining pathogens, the theoretical synergy there is strong.
The theoretical synergy is definitely strong, but concentrating these molecules into trace amounts for a commercial chewable creates a completely different biological reality.
It really does.
And that brings us to the most glaring caveat in the Biopreneur review, which is the proprietary blend loophole. DentaBiome lists these heavy-hitting ingredients, but they conceal the individual milligram dosages behind a proprietary label.
This raises an important question about therapeutic thresholds,
Huge question.
because understanding the mechanism of an ingredient means nothing if the dosage is too low to trigger that mechanism in the human body.
It's the equivalent of a recipe demanding salt to cure meat, but refusing to disclose whether you're using a teaspoon or a 10-pound bag.
That's exactly it.
The chemical mechanism of salt curing is real, but the dose completely determines the outcome. If we look at the clinical data on xylitol, achieving that futile starvation cycle in S mutants generally requires a daily exposure of 6 to 10 grams, spread out over multiple exposures. But the review notes that DentaBiome utilizes xylitol primarily as a trace flavoring agent.
Right, and a trace amount of a 5-carbon sugar alcohol might provide a minor localized effect, but it cannot be directly equated to the robust cavity prevention statistics cited in the 10-gram clinical trials. The proprietary blend label prevents the consumer and independent researchers from verifying if the product actually meets the minimum therapeutic threshold for any of its active components.
And extracting and condensing these compounds into a daily supplement introduces a secondary layer of complexity regarding safety, too,
Yes.
because a food-based compound behaves differently in an isolated, concentrated format.
Absolutely. Now, the safety profile for human consumption is generally well tolerated, with no systemic adverse events reported in the independent data. However, the specific ingredient profile requires 2 critical real-world warnings.
This is super important for you to hear if you have pets.
Definitely. The first warning involves the xylitol. While metabolic starvation is great for fighting oral bacteria, xylitol triggers a massive, rapid release of insulin in dogs.
It tricks the canine pancreas into thinking a massive amount of sugar just entered the bloodstream.
Yes, and the resulting insulin spike causes profound canine hypoglycemia, and it can lead to acute hepatic necrosis or liver failure very quickly.
It's terrifying how fast it happens.
It is. Even a discarded chewable tablet could be fatal to a small pet. So strict isolation of the product is entirely non-negotiable.
Right. And the second warning the review highlighted was regarding the cranberry extract. Concentrated cranberry contains compounds that can inhibit the CYP2C9 enzyme in the liver.
And that specific liver enzyme is responsible for metabolizing certain anticoagulants, most notably warfarin. So if the enzyme is inhibited by the cranberry extract, the blood-thinning medication stays in the bloodstream longer than intended, which increases the risk of uncontrolled bleeding. Anyone on an anticoagulant regimen must consult their hematologist before introducing a concentrated cranberry supplement.
Always consult your doctor. So we have this really complex mosaic here. We have a vastly superior delivery mechanism in postbiotics, a brilliantly real but unproven in the product FabM genetic theory, and a solid ingredient deck that's unfortunately obscured by proprietary dosing.
Right, it's a mixed bag.
So to understand the actual utility of this supplement, we have to strip away the theory and look at the behavioral data. What actually happens when thousands of people chew these every day?
Well, the Biopreneur review aggregated a significant volume of independent user data from platforms like Trustpilot and Reddit, carefully filtering out the incentivized testimonials.
Just the real users.
Exactly. And the data reveals a very clear timeline of efficacy. The most consistently reported verifiable benefit is a significant reduction in halitosis bad breath. This improvement is generally noted rapidly, usually within the first 7 to 14 days of consistent use.
Which perfectly aligns with the physical mechanics of a dissolving tablet, right?
Right.
The postbiotics and the xylitol are directly interacting with the volatile sulfur compound producing bacteria on the back of the tongue and the gum line. You are changing the chemical environment immediately upon chewing.
You are. However, the data also highlights the deceptive nature of some of the more aggressive performance claims. Specifically, the assertion, heavily implied in their marketing, that the product can halt bleeding gums in as little as 3 days.
Yeah, we have to debunk that immediately because the biological timeline for tissue regeneration simply does not operate on a 72-hour window.
It's just not physically possible.
Gingivitis, bleeding gums, is an active inflammatory response to a bacterial infection in the gingival tissue. Even if a postbiotic tablet instantly neutralized every single pathogen in your mouth on day 1, the inflamed gum tissue still has to physically heal.
It's exactly. The cellular turnover rate for gingival fibroblasts requires time. A reduction in inflammation and a cessation of bleeding upon probing typically requires 3 to 8 weeks of sustained environmental improvement.
3 to 8 weeks.
Right. So a consumer expecting a 3-day miracle will likely abandon the protocol on day 4, believing the product is a total failure simply because they are sold an impossible biological timeline.
And navigating the purchase itself requires some vigilance, too. The independent reviews heavily flag the checkout architecture on the official website.
Oh yes, the dark patterns.
Yeah. Users aren't reporting adverse health reactions, but they are reporting a gauntlet of confusing digital upsells. The purchase flow uses aggressive pre-checked boxes and countdown timers, leading one verified Trustpilot user to accidentally authorize a charge for 15 bottles of the supplement.
15 bottles. The user experience design is optimized for maximum initial order value, which unfortunately distracts from the core biological utility of the product.
Which makes the review's primary actionable advice so valuable. They outline a 45-day checkpoint strategy that leverages the underlying consumer protection framework. DentaBiome is sold through the ClickBank payment processing platform, which legally mandates a 60-day empty bottle refund policy.
Which is a great safety net.
It is. You don't have to argue with the vendor's customer service. The payment processor guarantees the window.
But utilizing that 60-day window intelligently requires establishing an objective baseline.
Right. You take a highly lit close-up photograph of your upper and lower gum lines on day 1.
Yeah.
Because you look in the mirror every single morning, your brain will normalize slow, gradual changes in tissue inflammation.
You won't notice the difference.
Exactly. You cannot rely on memory to judge efficacy. Then you set a hard calendar alert for day 45.
And on day 45, you conduct a tripartite evaluation. You compare the current state of your gingival tissue against the day 1 photograph. You evaluate the physical sensation of flossing, specifically noting any reduction in hemorrhaging. And you assess the subjective improvement in morning breath odor.
By anchoring the decision to day 45, you have allowed the postbiotics enough time to interact with the biofilm, and you've given the gingival fibroblasts the necessary weeks to actually regenerate collagen and reduce inflammation. Crucially, you still have a 2-week buffer to easily initiate the ClickBank refund process if the proprietary dosages simply weren't enough to move the needle for your specific microbiome.
It completely removes the anxiety from the trial period.
Yeah.
You are matching the evaluation timeline to the biological reality, not the marketing copy.
So what does this all mean? When we synthesize the university microbiology, the clinical mechanisms of xylitol and cranberry packs, and the reality of the proprietary label, the verdict requires nuance.
It definitely isn't black and white.
Right. DentaBiome is manufactured in a GMP-certified FDA-registered facility, so we aren't dealing with a black market scam here. Furthermore, the foundational transition from live probiotics to a postbiotic delivery system is a massive, scientifically validated leap forward. It elegantly solves the salivary survival problem.
The caveat, though, is expectation management. This is a prophylactic and maintenance tool for mild dysbiosis. It leverages genuine biological pathways like P-fimbriae inhibition to help manage the bacterial load. But it cannot reverse active periodontal disease, and it certainly cannot replace mechanical plaque removal.
You still have to brush your teeth.
Yes, please brush your teeth. And the obscure dosages mean you are relying on the synergy of the blend rather than therapeutic maximums of individual ingredients.
If we connect this to the bigger picture.
The broader takeaway is really about how we evaluate consumer health technology. The gap between an incredible in vitro discovery, like the FabM lipid membrane shift, and a commercial chewable tablet is vast.
It's an ocean.
As consumers, we have to separate the elegance of the underlying science from the reality of the physical product's delivery and dosing. Understanding how a postbiotic bypasses the stomach acid bottleneck is critical, but we must also recognize when a brand is using a verified scientific mechanism as a marketing halo for an unproven proprietary blend.
It forces us to elevate our criteria. And that leaves me with a lingering thought for you to explore long after this deep dive ends. We've just spent 20 minutes analyzing how a postbiotic delivery system allows beneficial compounds to bypass the destructive environment of the mouth and stomach.
The hurricane, as you called it.
Right, the hurricane. But if non-living metabolites can successfully deliver targeted chemical signals without being destroyed by our own enzymes, it opens up a massive horizon. It makes you wonder, across all your health routines, are you focusing too much on what you are consuming and completely ignoring how your body is actually able to absorb it?
That's a profound question.
Because think about it, how long until the pharmaceutical industry abandons live cultures entirely and starts using this exact postbiotic delivery mechanism for the gut-brain axis? Imagine taking a localized postbiotic to deliver targeted neurotransmitter precursors for anxiety or depression, completely bypassing the volatility of stomach acid and live gut fermentation.
The oral microbiome is just the proving ground. The implications for targeted, non-living biological delivery throughout the entire human body are staggering.
Something to think about the next time you look at the supplement aisle.